Trouble with the trolley, eh?
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So today is the 5-year anniversary of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, which for those of you who don't know is a modern HD remake of the original Spyro trilogy from the late 90s. Long-time subscribers of mine will know that the original Spyro trilogy is my personal favourite video game series ever made. In fact, when I did my top 100 favourite games list last year, all 3 of them made it into my top 10, with Spyro 3 being number 1. I'll leave a link to that list in the description section. I also reviewed each of the Spyro games individually a while back. Again, link in description. With the game now being 5 years old, and the dust well and truly settled on it, I figured now would be a great time to give it a proper retrospective review, since I have enough experience with the game now to look at it as rationally and objectively as possible, without being blinded by superficial traits such as hype or nostalgia. In addition to the game being 5 years old, the original Spyro the Dragon game from 1998 also recently saw its 25th anniversary. Man, I feel old. And to mark that occasion, as some of you already know, I decided to do a full 100% let's play of each Spyro game, using my original PS1 discs. Yeah, I still have them and have kept them in pretty good condition over the years, but I digress. This gave me a perfect opportunity to experience each of the games in their original form, doing a full playthrough of each, before returning to the remaster for the purpose of this review. So I now have as good a comparison between them as ever. Was the remake an improvement on the originals, or was it a downgrade? Or was it just an unnecessary cash grab that didn't need to exist? Let's talk about it.
Well, two can play at this bombing game. Let's go!
So with me being a huge fan of the originals, it goes without saying that I was very interested in the announcement of a remake being made for modern consoles. However, at the same time, I was a little bit apprehensive about it. The reason for this is that the remake came out in an era where the general quality of gaming just wasn't very good. I'm honestly not a fan of the 8th generation, and I personally see it as a bit of a write-off. Also, I felt it would be very difficult for a HD remake, made by a different developer, to capture the same overall feel of the original games, while making the necessary technical and visual improvements to justify the asking price. Nonetheless, I bought the game at full price on its release, which believe me is something I very rarely do nowadays, and decided to give it a chance. One thing you'll notice about the game right off the bat, and this should really go without saying given that it's a HD remake, is that the game is absolutely beautiful. The graphical fidelity of the game, as well as some of the new art style, is absolutely top notch. It really is a great looking game. The character models are all completely revamped, with a tremendous amount of detail, and the backgrounds, textures and animations are truly gorgeous. Even now, 5 years later, I'm still blown away by how the game looks. Sure, there are certain design choices I wasn't personally fond of, and this is something that annoyed me when I first played the game, more on that later. But for the most part I like the game's presentation. In addition to this, the overall controls and gameplay are as good as ever, with the developers keeping what worked in the originals, while refining certain aspects of them. The game feels just as smooth and fluid as the originals, for the most part anyway. So yeah, looking at the game from purely a technical point of view, and judging it not as its own game, but as simply a HD remake, the game pretty much succeeds where it was supposed to. Here's the thing though. Despite all this, there was always something about the game that put me off, and for a while I couldn't put my finger on it. Let me do my best to explain as I describe in great detail just exactly what the Spyro games have to offer. And of course, since I reviewed these games individually in the past, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, I'm just going to give you the basics. And as I said, tell you what they have to offer. The first game was revolutionary for its time, being one of the fastest and most fluid games to be released in the 90s, with incredibly smooth and fluid controls and gameplay that honestly still hold up today. The game has pretty good combat for the time, with enemies that had pretty sophisticated AI. Unlike in most 90s platformers, enemies in the game would actually target Spyro, and provide a genuine challenge to a new player. In addition to that, the game pretty much perfected platforming, with levels that felt like huge obstacle courses, filled with jumps, glides, enemies, traps and hazards, and all sorts of curiosities and roadblocks. Each level was designed in a somewhat circular fashion, making them feel non-linear, like each level was its own huge sandbox, and the main objective of each level was to acquire collectibles. The game is basically a completionist's wet dream, meaning if you're like me, and you love hunting for collectibles and generally exploring levels, you would have an absolute blast with the game the whole way through. And for me, the icing on the cake, and something that I've talked about in great detail in the past, is the soundtrack. Spyro the Dragon has, in my personal opinion, one of the greatest soundtracks in gaming history. With Stuart Copeland providing the music for the game, each level has music that perfectly suits the overall style and atmosphere of them. Genuinely a masterpiece that complements the game perfectly. In short, the original Spyro game is a certified masterpiece. Sure, the boss battles were a bit simplistic, and the game was pretty short, but I was never bored at any point while playing, and I honestly think that the platforming genre wouldn't have been what it became if the original Spyro hadn't set such a high standard. Had Spyro not become a series, then Spyro 1 would have easily been a great standalone game that stood out over pretty much all the competition that it had back in the day. Of course that wasn't the case, and the following year the game received a much anticipated sequel, Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer, aka Ripto's Rage for you Americans. It took everything that was great about the first game and not only replicated it, but improved, expanded and basically perfected it, making one of the greatest games of all time. Spyro 2 took what was already, in my opinion, a 10 out of 10 masterpiece and somehow made it even better. With more refined controls, better combat, more collectibles and enemy variety, as well as a far more interesting story. Spyro 2 is an absolute blast, with levels that are bigger, more fun, and with more replay value than the first game. It also introduced new collectibles, as well as new unlockable abilities that Spyro can learn and acquire throughout the game. Certain challenges and collectibles were locked off to you on a first playthrough, meaning you would have to first learn a particular ability to later return and acquire them. This of course added a tremendous amount of replay value to the game. Sure, the platforming challenges weren't as difficult or as stimulating as the first game, but the game makes up for it by adding a whole bunch of minigames and side activities to add to the variety of the game, each of which provide a welcome challenge of their own. However, what may actually be the biggest improvement Spyro 2 made over the first game is the boss battles. Let me be as blunt as I possibly can. Spyro 2 has, in my personal opinions, the greatest boss battles in gaming history, and my personal favourite boss battles of the entire series. Stuart Copeland returns to provide the music for the game, with a soundtrack that even rivals the first game. And this once again adds to the overall atmosphere. Long story short, Spyro 2 expanded on what made the first game so great, and was even better. The following year we got the third installment, Spyro 3 aka Spyro Year of the Dragon, and in my personal opinion, this was where the Spyro series peaked. Again, it took everything that worked about the first two games, and improved and expanded upon it. In addition to that, they even added a whole bunch of new content and innovation. For example, they added several new playable characters, each of which felt completely unique and different from one another, including allowing you to play as returning characters such as Sparks and Hunter. New challenges and minigames, more convoluted levels, as well as numerous collectibles and curiosities, making Spyro 3, in my personal opinion, the greatest game of all time, and my personal favourite. The game also had loads of boss battles, 5 main bosses, with a whole bunch of mini bosses, making the game an absolute blast. So that pretty much sums up in a nutshell the original Spyro trilogy, and as I mentioned before, I already reviewed each of them individually in the past, again link in description. Here I want to talk specifically about the remake, and what it has to offer, and ultimately discuss whether or not the remake fully succeeded, or whether or not it was even necessary. So the remake of course attempted to introduce a whole new generation of gamers to the series, as great as the originals are, and I will still play them for the rest of my life. A lot of modern gamers just won't play anything unless it has HD, photorealistic graphics and character models. So from this point of view, the remake served its purpose. And as I mentioned before, it's a beautiful game. But as I also mentioned before, there were several things about it that put me off and disappointed me.
Who needs a key when you know how to chant like this?
One thing that disappointed me was the lack of extra content, as well as the removal of several aspects from the original. One of the things that's quite well known about the originals is that there was a lot of cut content, full levels, challenges and bosses that weren't added to the games, due to the rushed development cycle they had, being made one after the other. It was a great opportunity for the remake to add in some of this content, maybe some new levels, new boss battles and new collectibles, as well as to expand the game a bit, but sadly the remake didn't do that. They did add a couple of things, such as the whirlwind from Midnight Mountain that was supposed to appear in the original after defeating the sorceress. The whirlwind would take you to an unreachable island, where you would find some extra lives. It wasn't added to the original due to time restraints, but thankfully they added it here. But sadly that's about all they added in terms of cut content. It's a shame they never added the secret cave in Fireworks Factory that you can access by using a proxy jump. I showed this in my Spyro 3 Let's Play. Yeah, sadly they never added this to the remake. Also the secret unused level in Dino Mines that you could access by using the swimming glitch. There were rumours for years of a cut mini-boss that was originally going to be added here, but was cut due to time restraints. That would have been awesome to see in the remake. But again, sadly they never added it to the game. There were so many missed opportunities like that honestly disappointed me. In addition to my disappointments regarding the lack of added content, another issue that I had with the game was some of the artistic changes that were made here and there. As great as the game looks in terms of graphical fidelity, some of the colour palettes in the levels just don't look right to me, particularly in Spyro 1. This is entirely subjective of course, but I honestly prefer the colour palette and overall visual aesthetic of the original in some of these levels. And perhaps the most annoying difference for me was the overall sound design and voice acting. The original Spyro games had a very distinct style of voice acting throughout. Characters you would meet in the game were often over-the-top parodies, with hilarious voices that you weren't meant to take seriously. And sadly, pretty much all the voices in the game have been re-recorded, many of them using different voice actors. And for me, the new voices just didn't work at all. I mean, listen to this comparison for example.
With all the budget cuts, these elevators need serious work. See, this one here is stuck. I expect it would start working if you could just give it a good whack, though.
With all the budget cuts, these elevators need serious work. See, this one here is stuck. I expect it will start working again if you just give it a good whack, though.
The ox is very tough. I advise using the bombs against it, and it'll probably take several bombs at that.
The ox is very tough. I would advise using the bombs against it, and it will probably take several bombs at that.
Characters who are voiced by legendary voice actors such as Greg Berger or Neil Ross have been completely replaced here. And the new voices just don't work for me. They didn't suit these characters at all. Particularly Hunter's voice. What even was that? Greg Berger even returns to voice Ripto here, so why he couldn't have reprised his role as Hunter, I just don't get it. Even some of the chants and ambient sounds were changed, and in some cases even flat out removed. Like for example the wind that you hear at the highest point in Autumn Plains. Yeah, it's been completely removed here. Or the sound that the orbs make when you unlock them. Yeah, completely removed, and I'm not sure why. Even the level complete celebration sound is gone. It's things like that I remember most about games. Little quirks, memorable locations and ambient sounds that all add to the atmosphere. Removing them just detracts from the overall experience in my opinion. Speaking of sounds, they added a new remixed soundtrack to the game, with each level's music being remixed, and thank God they gave us the ability to switch back to the original soundtrack in the pause menu. Because, and let me be blunt here, the remixes are absolute rubbish. They can't hold a candle to the original in my opinion. Speaking of changes, I also wasn't fond of some of the character redesigns. Some of them are okay, but others like Sheila the Kangaroo for example, look terrible in my opinion and nothing like the original. I don't get why they changed them so much. Another thing that kinda put me off the remake was the removal of all the cool glitches and exploits the original had. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not actually complaining about this, since I understand the game is on a completely different engine from the originals, and of course they were supposed to fix all the technical issues and glitches. But from my own personal perspective, and this is shared by many Spyro fans, the glitches in the original were actually to the game's strengths rather than its weaknesses. For example, the swimming glitch that allows you to get out of bounds and access new areas, showing and exploring some of the game's inner workings. This was all part of the charm and the fun of the original, since it added so much more replay value to the game, and removing this, while I get it was necessary, it just puts me off since it's not the same. Again, this is not necessarily a criticism, it's just a personal issue of mine. I grew up with the originals, so the overall quirks, glitches and exploits, none of which were really game breaking, were things I had fun with. There were some other issues I had with the remake. It actually has several technical issues of its own, and unlike the original, some of these are game breaking. For example, the game is extremely prone to crashing. The game will crash for seemingly no reason, dialogue will bug out, entering new areas will often cause some major clipping issues, and Spyro will sometimes just completely spaz out. During my most recent playthrough, I noticed that the Tunnel of Love in Dragon Shores was completely broken. I mean, just watch this.
Free! You pay no money down and make no monthly payments. In return, I'll give you one token. One is all I can give, but you can ride as many times as you'd like. Hop aboard, my... Just for kids. Back to take a whirl. Well, it's pretty. Back to take a whirl.
Yeah, at first Spyro was stuck in an endless loop, and I actually had to quit the game to escape. Then when I tried it again, the controls just randomly broke, and all I could do was move the game's camera, nothing else worked. Yeah, I don't know what it is about the Tunnel of Love in particular, and what exactly causes this issue, but it's completely broken. For the most part though, if you're able to look past these technical issues, and deal with a few crashes here and there, then the game is still a lot of fun. One thing that might annoy you though is the loading times. That's one thing that I would say is a major downgrade from the originals. In the original games, levels would load almost immediately, and when you die, you would respawn right away without even needing to load. But in this game, every time you enter a new level, or die, you get a long ass loading screen that varies in length. Sometimes they take less than 20 seconds. Other times they take more than 40 seconds. It just seems to be completely random. This did get on my nerves a bit since it contrasted with the overall fast-paced and hectic gameplay. Though I do like that you could still control Spyro during some of the loading screens, that was quite cool. Another minor nitpick I had is that some of the game's levels seem to be scaled wrong. For example, look at the Gulp boss battle. When compared to the original, it just didn't look right to me, and the level felt so much smaller, and you seem to have a lot less room to work and avoid attacks. Again, this isn't a major issue, just a minor nitpick. Also, and I wasn't sure whether to mention this, but I will anyway, but there were several changes to the game that were made purely for the sake of political correctness, which is a pet hate of mine. For example, they removed every enemy type that had guns, and instead replaced them with silly looking pink slime guns, and stuff like that. Their justification for this was that having guns in the game was unsuitable for children, bearing in mind that a lot of kids nowadays play Call of Duty, but I digress. It makes these enemies look way out of place in some of the levels, and if truth be told, they look quite ridiculous. It's just an unnecessary change that dumbed down the game. They also changed the name of one of the characters, Bombo, renaming him Bob. I mean, come on man, was that really necessary? I suppose this won't really bother you if you never played the original, but for me it was just ridiculous. The original games were fine, nobody got offended, nobody got upset, you didn't need to change these things. So long story short, Spyro Reignited Trilogy is a great game, but being a great game wasn't enough, since the originals are already great, and for me, in order to fully justify the asking price, they needed to add more content, have flawless technicalities, and keep everything that worked about the original while making the game simply look and play better. And did they accomplish all of this? I'm not so sure. What do you guys think? All in all, I would recommend the remake if you see it for a cheap price. Chances are, any issues that I have as a veteran of the series probably won't bother you personally. But even if you do play this, I would urge you to also play the originals at some point if you can. Because if not, then you don't know what you're missing out on, it is what it is. And I give the game, all things being considered, a solid 8 out of 10. The changes in style and sound design that I wasn't fond of, and the technical issues detract from the score. But all in all, I would still recommend the game for a very cheap price, just buy it pre-owned. Yeah, don't give the gaming industry your money, buy everything pre-owned. Let me know what you guys think, stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.